Hello, and welcome to Nation Underdog. I'm Mark Harvey. When we talk about American history, many are drawn to the 1960s and its social unrest, protest, and music. But what many don't realize is that the seeds of social conflict were planted the decade before, in the 1950s. In order for there to be a civil and a Voting Rights Act, student protests, Beatles in the 1960s, you needed demographic changes, social unrest, teenagers, and rock and roll that emerged in the 1950s first. The 1960s were an exciting, progressive, and scary time. What do you associate with the 1950s? Disneyland, pictures of little kids playing around innocently in suburban neighborhoods with white picket fences and perfect little cracker box, colorful houses in suburbia. The parents are Ward and June Cleaver. That's certainly a common image, and even the picture of rock and roll during this time period is one of relative innocence. I mean, so often we think about kids going to the sock hop with the happy 1950s rock and roll music, clean and clear and untainted by drugs and all that bad stuff that's happening in the 1960s. Well, if the 1950s were such a clean, perfect, happy time, then why are we in a bar? Why am I filming this in my favorite local pub, the Red Dragon? This tiny pub has some history. Let's start with this pub sign over here. That's a sign that came from Bill Jones, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. If you look at the back, you'll realize that it's actually dated. The back of it's actually signed with fellow patrons, people who spent some time with him down at a local pub there in Germany. First, I'd like to show you this here. This is a mug that Bill brought back from Germany. And another thing to look at here is this lighter. He carried this thing with him in his pocket every time he jumped out of airplanes. You know, we forget that we're only 5 to 10 years past the end of World War II. We still had the draft. Young American men were still stationed all around the world. It may have seemed peaceful, but the reality was quite different. Of course, the people who were primarily living in the Disneyland paradise were white men. Of course, women at the time were primarily viewed as sex symbols or domestic goddesses, and it wasn't really until the 1960s where significant women's liberation altered that picture. Well, let's return for a second to Bill Jones back in Germany. Why did we have troops stationed in Germany in the first place? Well, as you probably know, it's not easy to make a transition from an occupational government and a force to a local force and a local democratic government through democratic transition. There's always insurgents trying to fight the occupiers. And a lot of times that was fairly understated. I don't know if they just didn't report it at the time or what, but there are personal anecdotes of this kind of thing happening. Bill tells stories about local Germans, some he claims were probably former Gestapo, riding on motorcycles with explosives strapped to their back, attacking American convoys. He says that he actually survived a failed attempt by someone trying to do that, and this was 1956 when he served. But the other fact to consider is that the Soviets occupied East Germany and Eastern Europe. This was a confrontational occupation, and it was scary. The Western world, and America in particular, were worried about communists. And this fear was stoked by Senator McCarthy, who went through the American bureaucracy to isolate people, sometimes political enemies and sometimes just people who seemed suspicious, as potential communists. People were brought up before Congress, persecuted, blackballed in many parts of the industry, certainly in the entertainment industry. And why was there a need to vilify communists during this time period? Well, it served our foreign policy goals. We were threatened by the Soviet Union. Harry Truman declared something called the Truman Doctrine to protect free people everywhere from subjugation. In this case, what he meant by subjugation was communism. A lot of folks were afraid that we were going to end up with some sort of a World War III. American kids in particular were worried about being drafted and then having to go off and serve in some sort of a war someplace in the world in order to try to fight the Soviets. At the same time, you have another factor, which is that teens now have sometimes jobs, certainly much more disposable income than they had at any time in history. Advertisers are marketing toward them specifically to try to get them to buy like a record player go out and buy the records and get involved in what increasingly became teen culture. Another factor to think about in this whole mix is the race issue. That is, that the United States was still largely segregated. 1865 and the end of the Civil War did not mean freedom for most African Americans in the United States, despite the fact that the Constitution was amended. It wasn't until 1964-65 where a lot of these Jim Crow laws that enforced segregation and laws that prevented African Americans from voting were ultimately reversed. And it took a number of activists, including Martin Luther King among others, to try to turn that around. And this craziness was happening in the 1950s, where African Americans were demanding better schools, trying to get out of a permanent situation of being a dominated underclass. For them, it was challenging and also liberating, but for a lot of white Americans who were worried about, what's going to happen next, and I don't know about this whole integration thing, it was scary, it was weird, and quite honestly, it was racist. Another factor we don't always talk about is the urban-rural divide, the fact that there was an increasing rich-poor gap, and a lot of the wealth was focused in the cities. And a lot of folks from rural areas started going to urban areas in search of new opportunity. And a great example of this is the exodus of blues performers that went from the South all the way to Chicago or all the way to Memphis in order to try to seek opportunity. And in the process of this, they were bringing their own kind of music, their own style of performance. And so things that would have been out in a honky-tonk somewhere in the case of poor white folks, or up in a juke joint somewhere in the case of poor black folks, were basically being moved into the city. It's all well and good as long as it's in the bar where people are having drinks and places of ill repute, but it certainly wouldn't be considered acceptable in white suburban society. Keep in mind, it's also sort of lined up with a whole revolution in terms of delivery of information, the growth of television, the growth of radio during that time period, and the ability to deliver this information, right? So you have fear, you have money, you have major demographic shifts, all of which creates an artistic explosion which really hasn't been seen before or since then. It is the social response to the fear from communism, fear of integration, fear of a new kind of art that's emerging in society, the fear of what happens when the urban and the rural collide, that really ends up becoming an explosion in the 1960s, where people then begin to respond by saying, is this something I want to join and fight, or is it something that I want to ultimately escape from?